Have you ever noticed someone in your family forgetting names or simple details of everyday life? That's exactly what happened to my mother. At first, we thought it was normal, but the frequency began to worry us. That's when a neurologist surprised us with a simple tip, an activity that takes only 1 minute a day. In this video, I'll tell you what he recommended and how it transformed her memory in just a few weeks. At first, it was small things, almost imperceptible, easily attributed to fatigue or natural aging. My mother has always been a very active woman. Even after 60, she kept the house spotless, cooked with surgical precision without ever needing to consult a recipe, and remembered birthdays, appointments, and even the names of my childhood schoolmates with impressive clarity. She has always been the living memory of our family. So when she began to hesitate when saying the name of an old neighbor or forget where she had put her keys, no one thought it was anything out of the ordinary. We attributed it to age, to everyday distractions. She herself laughed at her own mistakes and said, "Oh, I have a head in the clouds." But as with many problems that start slowly, almost silently, what seemed harmless began to take shape. I clearly remember one morning when we went to the supermarket together. We were walking down the aisles and she, with her list in hand, stood frozen in front of the sauce shelf. "What was it I needed to get?" she muttered, staring at the packages. When I replied that it was tomato paste, she smiled slightly, but there was something different in her eyes, a kind of frustration, an irritation with herself that I wasn't used to seeing. That night she mentioned to my father that she was feeling weird, as if her mind was tired, even though she hadn't done much. That was the first time I realized that maybe it wasn't just distraction. As the months went by, the forgetfulness ceased to be occasional and began to affect her routine. She often repeated stories, forgot she had already told something. She began to avoid answering the phone, saying she mixed up her words and felt embarrassed. Once, while visiting a longtime friend, she called her by the wrong name, something unthinkable for her, who had always been so attentive to other people's personal details. It was no longer just forgetting where she left her glasses or her purse. It was forgetting faces, names, why we were in a certain place. It was as if part of her was beginning to disconnect from the present. Even tasks she had always done with ease began to become a challenge. Several times we found her staring at the stove, unable to remember whether she had seasoned the food or not. Visibly distressed, she began carrying a small notebook in her pocket to write down simple tasks such as water the plants or take medicine at 10 a.m. Coming from someone so independent and organized, this was a clear sign that something more serious was happening. My mother, however, was reluctant to admit it. She had a dignity, a fierce desire to maintain control of her own life, which prevented her from accepting that her mind might be failing, and this denial, understandable and painful, only made the situation worse. She began to avoid social events, family gatherings, and meetings with friends. She said she was tired, but we knew there was shame behind it. She was afraid of forgetting the name of someone close to her, afraid of getting lost in the middle of a conversation and not knowing how to get back. She began to become increasingly silent. Silence began to fill the space that was once filled with stories, comments, and laughter. Seeing this happen to her right before our eyes was a deeply distressing experience for everyone in the family. It was my father who, once again, insisted that we seek medical help. He saw my mother's suffering and, while respecting her time and space, realized that we could no longer ignore the signs. Her fear was that the word Alzheimer's would come up, and in fact, that was the fear of all of us. But what we discovered when we sought out a neurologist was something more complex and at the same time more hopeful. Human memory is like a muscle. It can weaken over time with stress, with bad habits. But like a muscle, it can also be stimulated, strengthened, and reactivated. The specialist explained that early forgetfulness, called mild cognitive impairment, is common and often reversible, or at least stabilizable, if diagnosed early and treated with appropriate strategies. This initial diagnosis was paradoxically a relief. We were not dealing with advanced dementia as we had feared, but rather with a condition that could be contained with dedication, discipline, and monitoring. It was at this point that the neurologist introduced us to a concept that at first glance seemed too simple to be true: the daily practice of short, specific cognitive exercises, some of which took less than a minute a day. The focus was not only on memory, but also on attention, association of ideas, and language. He explained that the brain responds better to consistency than to intensity. There was no point in proposing long, complex tasks that would demotivate her. Something brief but done every day like a ritual was enough. My mother, still reluctant, agreed to start with small challenges. She began with an exercise of quickly naming 5 objects in the kitchen by looking around, or trying to remember what she had eaten last Tuesday. Simple things, but they required attention and focus. Gradually, she incorporated this into her routine as if it were part of her day, and the results, though subtle at first, began to emerge. emerge. Concern began to set in quietly, like a shadow lengthening in the late afternoon. At first, as I mentioned before, we tried to minimize it. Each time my mother forgot something, we took it lightly, as a joke between us, as if to say, "Oh, it's just her age." We laughed together, even her. But something inside me, perhaps a daughter's instinct, began to realize that it wasn't just that. Her gaze changed when she forgot something important. It wasn't just distraction, it was frustration, it was fear. A kind of emptiness crossed her eyes for a moment, as if she herself felt she was losing something that had always been hers, control of her mind, her memory, her very identity. My father, always so rational, was the first to admit it out loud. This isn't normal. He knew my mother like no one else. Married for decades, they shared a solid routine, guided by almost unchanging habits, and he began to notice breaks in that logic. Small delays, lapses in conversation, repeated questions within minutes of each other, and more than that, she was ceasing to be herself in subtle ways. The woman who made lists for everything, who organized the closets by color, who even kept the books on the shelf in alphabetical order, now left tasks half done, mixed up pots and pans, forgot the names of common objects. It was as if loose threads were beginning to disconnect part of her essence. The decision to see a neurologist was not easy. There was deep emotional resistance, especially on her part. My mother never liked doctors, not because she distrusted them, but out of pride. For her, admitting she needed help was a sign of weakness. "I'm just a little tired, that's all," she would say, even when it was clear that it was more than just fatigue. Taking her to the doctor's office required patience, empathy, and above all, a lot of love. We did it carefully, without direct pressure, but showing her that it was for her own good, for our peace of mind, for prevention. We presented it as a routine appointment, like someone who just wants to check their blood pressure or get some blood tests done. But we all knew, including her, that there was something deeper behind that visit. The neurologist's office was in an old building with light-colored walls and quiet corridors. The waiting room was sober, decorated with neutral paintings and neuroscience books on the table. I remember well the sound of the clock ticking away the minutes as we waited. My mother was visibly tense. Her hands were sweating slightly, and she tried to hide it by fiddling with her purse, fixing her hair, looking away. When we were called, she stood up with a rehearsed calm, as if to prove, even there, that everything was under control. The doctor was a slow-speaking man with a direct but kind gaze. He greeted us firmly and made it clear from the outset that he was not there to judge, but to understand. And that is exactly what he did. The consultation began with simple questions: name, age, profession, date. My mother answered confidently, but hesitated when trying to remember the full name of her youngest granddaughter. Then came the tests, sequences of numbers to repeat, objects to name, images to describe. With each new task, you could see the enormous effort she was making, not just to get it right, but to not show any weakness. The doctor watched closely, silently taking notes. At one point, he asked her to describe the route from her house to the neighborhood market. She started off well, but soon lost her way. She was visibly shaken. She crossed her arms and said she wasn't used to being evaluated like a student. The doctor gently explained that this wasn't a test, but a window into how her mind was functioning. At the end of the consultation, the neurologist was direct but reassuring. He said that what he was observing was a possible case of mild cognitive impairment, a common condition in people over the age of 60, which may or may not progress, depending on several factors. He explained that it was not yet Alzheimer's, but that it would be a mistake to ignore the signs. And more than medication, he recommended stimulation, lots of stimulation. The brain needs to be challenged just as the body needs physical exercise, he said, and then he presented the proposal that would change our routine. Small daily practices, lasting only a minute, but with high cognitive value. Activities that activate attention, language, and short-term memory. Simple things like listing words from a certain category, recounting the events of the previous day, or making quick visual associations. My mother, still suspicious, nodded. She didn't say much, but her expression was one of relief. Perhaps because she had finally put a name to what she had been feeling, perhaps because she realized she was not alone in this process, or perhaps because she understood that there were paths to follow, that this was not a sentence, but a warning. When we left the office, there was a long silence between us. In the elevator, only the mechanical sound of the floors passing by could be heard. Only when we got to the car did she take a deep breath and say, "If I have to fight this, I want to start now." And it was with that silent, almost whispered decision that we began a new stage. From then on, our focus turned to learning, understanding, and applying what the doctor had recommended. It wouldn't be easy, we knew, but it wasn't impossible either. In the days that followed, we began to adapt our home, our routine, and our own behaviors to help my mother rediscover the loose threads of her memory. And so, little by little, we began a process that, more than treatment, would be a journey journey of reconnection with herself. When we left the neurologist's office, we took with us not only a preliminary diagnosis, but also a new challenge to transform my mother's daily life into a routine of small mental activations. Contrary to what we expected, the doctor did not prescribe medication right away. He believed that at her stage, the most important thing was to rehabilitate her brain through stimulation. What surprised us most was the simplicity of the proposal. No complicated programs, no expensive equipment, nothing that would take hours out of the day. The neurologist told us firmly, if you can do just 1 minute of cognitive exercise a day, but do it consistently, you will see significant results. It sounded too good to be true. 1 minute? Just that? But over time, we understood the depth of this recommendation. What he was proposing was not a 1-minute miracle, but rather a daily trigger for neural reactivation. According to him, when stimulated in a focused and regular manner, the brain tends to respond more strongly than when exposed to sporadic and intense stimuli. It was like an analogy with weight training. There's no point in going to the gym once a month and lifting huge weights. What strengthens the muscles and by extension the mind is continuous exercise, even if it's light. The proposal was clear. 1 minute per day of directed activity, like turning on internal lights. But that minute had to be real, present, without distractions, like a conscious pause focused exclusively on the mind. The first recommended exercise was absurdly simple. So simple that my mother, at first, thought they were making fun of her. It consisted of choosing a room in the house, any room, and looking around naming as many visible objects as possible that began with a certain letter. For example, in the bedroom, with the letter C, she would say blanket, bed, chair, curtain. The challenge was to keep it flowing while focusing on the environment. At first, she did it with a certain disdain, as if she were doing a task without really believing in it. But after a few days, we noticed a subtle change. She started doing the exercise on her own, even without us reminding her. More than that, she began to challenge herself with new letters and new environments. It was as if her brain had suddenly discovered a hidden game, a silent way to move again. Another exercise came the following week. The neurologist suggested a practice called active recapitulation. At the end of the day, my mother was to sit down for a minute and try to list from memory the 5 main things she had done since morning. Nothing fancy. It could be something as simple as I brushed my teeth, had breakfast, called my sister, watered the plants, read a magazine. But there was one condition. She couldn't consult her notes or talk to anyone during that time. It was a direct dialogue with her own mind. At first, she was unsure. What if I forget what I did, she asked. But the neurologist had advised us, no matter how much she remembered, the important thing was to try. Forcing the recollection, even if incomplete, is in itself a valuable exercise. Soon she began to surprise everyone, including herself, with details she remembered, little things she had noticed throughout the day, such as the scent of a flower in the yard or a conversation between 2 neighbors on the street. There were also association exercises. For example, the neurologist recommended that when my mother saw any object, she should try to connect it to a memory or a story. She would hold a spoon and say, I remember the wooden spoon my grandmother used to make dulce de leche. Seeing a flower, she would say, these daisies remind me of the garden at the school where I studied. This not only activated areas of the brain linked to emotional memory, but also created emotional bonds that strengthen recall. It was almost like rekindling small points of light in areas that were fading. This type of activity began to spread throughout the house. It was as if suddenly everything could be a memory trigger. An old song, a smell, a color, a distant sound. We were all learning to rediscover my mother through these small connections. Over time, we created a kind of ritual. Every day, right after breakfast, she would do one of the exercises. Sometimes it was naming fruits that started with a certain letter. Other times, it was retelling a childhood story. Sometimes it was just looking at an old photo and saying the names of the people in it. It all lasted a minute or two at most, but those minutes took on a much greater symbolic value. They represented resistance, they represented struggle, they represented a conscious choice not to let herself be carried away by forgetfulness. And the most amazing thing is that with constant practice, results came. Not magically, but gradually. She began to remember names more easily, to finish sentences with more confidence. She was able to pick up conversations without getting lost in the middle of them. She started smiling more, participating more. Of course, not every day was the same. There were days when she was tired, days when she said her mind felt foggy, and that was okay. We didn't push her. The neurologist had been clear. The process is made up of steps forward and steps backward. The important thing was persistence. And my mother gradually came to understand that those daily minutes were not a punishment or a test, but a gesture of love for herself. It only took a few days to realize that something inside my mother was beginning to change. Not in a dramatic way like in a movie, movie, but in almost imperceptible details that, when added up, showed a real transformation. At first, it was like watching dry earth slowly absorb the first drops of rain after a long drought. Nothing happened immediate, but there was a silent movement of return to life, and it was precisely in these small, almost intimate gestures that the first results began to emerge. We weren't dealing with miracles, but with reunions between my mother and parts of herself that had begun to hide under the fog of oblivion. I clearly remember the day she called the mailman by name. He was a simple man who passed by every day, and she had known him for years, but for weeks, maybe months, she had been avoiding direct contact with him, precisely because she couldn't remember his name easily. When she saw him at the gate and said firmly, and with a smile, "Good morning, Mr. Marcio," my father and I looked at each other in silence. It was a name, just a name, but it represented much more than that. It represented the return of confidence, presence, autonomy. My mother smiled proudly, like someone who had won a silent battle against herself. And that moment, so simple, showed us that the daily minutes of encouragement were really having an effect. The changes spread like small cracks in a retaining wall that, until then, had held back the advance of memory loss. Long-forgotten memories began to surface, little stories rescued in the middle of a conversation. She began to refer to her grandchildren by name, without stumbling. She started asking questions about family matters, interested again in details that had previously escaped her. Even her speech became more fluid, as if words were filling in the gaps that had previously been blank. It was as if her brain, after weeks of being gently and persistently prodded, was beginning to respond. Perhaps not with the same strength as before, but with dignity, energy, and, above all, presence. There was one moment that stood out to me in particular. We were sitting at the table one evening when she began to tell me a story from her childhood that I had never heard before. She talked about a primary school teacher, about the smell of the classroom, about a rag doll she had won as a prize for learning to read early. It was a story rich in detail, full of emotion. More than the words, it was the sparkle in her eyes that moved us. It was as if she were accessing a part of herself that had been locked away for a long time and was now gently opening up like a window after a long storm. The most amazing thing is that she not only remembered, she felt safe to share, to reconnect with her own feelings. Confidence was the focal point of the change. It wasn't just her memory that was improving, but also the way my mother saw herself. When she realized she could do the exercises, no matter how simple, she smiled. It was a small, almost restrained smile, but full of meaning. It wasn't vanity, it was relief. Relief to realize that she still had control, that she wasn't adrift as she had feared before. And this emotional strengthening had a profound impact on her posture. She started calling her sisters again. She began accepting invitations to have coffee with her neighbors. She started dressing more carefully again. She began choosing her clothes with more intention, like someone rediscovering a forgotten role in their own story. Each of these gestures was a silent victory for us. Of course, it wasn't all good days. There were setbacks. There were mornings when she got confused and forgot if she had done her exercises. There were nights when she couldn't remember what she had had for dinner or what day of the week it was, and in those moments, the frustration returned. But the difference was that now she knew it was part of the process. It was no longer a scare, a collapse, a black hole. It was part of a journey with ups and downs, and most importantly, she knew she could keep trying. She no longer felt helpless. She felt like a participant, and that in itself was revolutionary. We as a family also changed. We learned to be more patient, to value more the moments when she remembered something. We began to celebrate everyday life with new eyes. Each memory recovered was like a gift. We created games together, turned meals into moments of conversation and encouragement. It was no longer a medical obligation. It was a collective reunion. We discovered that a person's memory does not belong only to them, but to everyone who loves them. And by taking care of my mother's mind, we were, in a way, taking care of the history of our entire family. And it was because of these advances, these small but significant victories, that we began to look for new ways to expand this process. We wanted more tools, more strategies, more ways to continue stimulating her mind without making her dependent on a rigid routine. We began to pay closer attention to how her mood, diet, physical activity, and even her surroundings directly influenced her memory and mental well-being. We knew that the 1-minute exercises had turned on an important light, but we also knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something deeper. After weeks immersed in this journey of rediscovering my mother's mind, we realized that the 1-minute exercise was like the tip of an iceberg, a small but impactful gesture that invited us to look more deeply at what had been sustaining or weakening her cognitive health over the years. We learned through observation and constant communication with the neurologist that memory is not just an isolated function of the brain, but the result of a subtle balance between various aspects of life: the body, emotions, nutrition, external stimuli, sleep quality, and social ties. And it was precisely at this point that we began to build a true ecosystem of care, all geared toward promoting mental functioning in a natural, respectful, and above all, loving way. The first big change was in the pace of the house. The speed at which we lived, even after my parents retired, was still driven by unnecessary urgencies, doing everything quickly, solving problems before they even arose, maintaining a routine that left no time to simply be. Gradually, we came to understand that my mother's brain, and that of anyone experiencing cognitive challenges, needed a slower-paced environment where she could be present in her tasks without the pressure to be efficient. We created routines with wide margins, where she could get dressed calmly, prepare tea with attention, walk in the yard without a watch. This wasn't just a kindness, it was part of the process of preserving her attention and memory. When the mind isn't overwhelmed, it remembers more, it records better, it feels safe. Another aspect that proved to be fundamental was nutrition. I confess that, at first, we had no idea how much eating habits influence mental health, but with professional guidance, we began to make small substitutions with a big impact. Less refined sugars, more foods rich in omega-3, antioxidants, and B vitamins. We introduced more brightly colored vegetables, red fruits, seeds such as chia and flaxseed, and even fish such as sardines and salmon on alternate days. The idea was never to turn her diet into a nutritional burden, but rather to include ingredients that, in addition to being tasty, act as true allies for brain health. We noticed that with a more balanced diet, her mood stabilized and her energy increased, two factors directly linked to the ability to remember, organize thoughts, and keep the mind active. Sleep also began to be treated with the importance it deserves. For a long time, my mother slept poorly. She would wake up in the middle of the night, spend hours awake, and take naps during the day. This not only affected her body, but also directly interfered with memory consolidation. The neurologist explained to us that the brain needs deep sleep to store what has been experienced, to filter what should be kept and what can be discarded. So we started paying more attention to her nighttime environment. Soft lighting, consistent schedules, no screens before bed, and a calm ritual before bedtime, such as listening to soft music or reading an excerpt from a familiar book. The difference was striking. With more regulated sleep, she began to wake up clearer, more focused, with less mental confusion in the early hours of the day. But perhaps the most transformative factor was the rediscovery of social bonds. For a long time, my mother had withdrawn out of shame, insecurity, fear of making mistakes, of forgetting, of failing in front of people, and this isolation, which seemed like a shield, was actually a silent trap. Memory needs other voices, other presences to stay alive. So we began, little by little, to rekindle her ties with the world. We encouraged visits from childhood friends, phone calls with relatives, simple gatherings in the garden with neighbors. We encouraged her to exchange letters, yes, letters, with a cousin who lived far away, and we got into the habit of reading excerpts from old poems together via video call. With each interaction, my mother became more alive, more present. She remembered better because she felt like she belonged again. At home, we also started to use memory in a playful way. We created simple games like Who Am I?, in which she had to remember people she knew from clues we gave her. We organized photo albums by decade so she could tell the stories behind the pictures in her own way. We made recipe books in which, in addition to the ingredients, she had to write stories related to the food, such as the cake I used to make for my brother's birthdays, or the dessert I learned from my neighbor in 1974. It was emotional memory in its purest, most powerful form. She wasn't just exercising her mind, she was rescuing the story of her life through her senses, emotions, and language. And then, as these natural habits became part of her routine, without obligation, without rigidity, but with consistency, something new began to blossom. My mother became more herself, with her memories, her quirks, her usual expressions. Of course, she still had moments of forgetfulness. There were cloudier days, moments when she would fall silent, lost in time, but there was also a new clarity, a presence that had previously been rare, and we, as a family, also began to realize how all these small gestures, these natural acts of care, not only preserved her memory, but also strengthened our own bonds. It was then that we began to reflect on what else could be done, not in a hurry, but with depth. Were there other practices, other approaches, perhaps even more integrated, that could help not only maintain but expand her cognitive abilities? We were willing to continue exploring, because when someone you love begins to come back to themselves, even if only little by little, even if only for brief moments, everything in you wants to find ways to prolong that return.